Test, don't guess. We all know that. And we want you to test better. Val Dynamo is a dynamometer specifically designed for MSK healthcare. It isn't a repurposed crane gauge or an inaccurate grip measure. You can push, pull, grip, and more. Plus, if that wasn't enough, its app for recording and storing the data is just brilliant. valdhealth.com/dynamo for the only measurement device you're going to need in clinic.
Claire Sullivan, welcome to Chewing It Over. What's the strongest argument against strike action?
Great to be here, Jack. Thanks for inviting me. And I mean, great first question, straight out of the traps, no mucking around. And of course, actually, the strongest argument against strike action is the same as the strongest argument for strike action. Because, of course, for people who are employees in their workplace who are working for an employer, there's a contract of employment. And whatever we say about bits of paper, the basic contract of employment is you pitch up for work and your employer pays you for doing it. And of course, when you take industrial action, it is actually fundamental that the reason you don't get paid when you take industrial action is because you're not turning up for work. And the reason why to turn the strongest argument against to the strongest argument for is that, of course, whatever you think about the politics of strike action, the reality is that employers have a lot of legal responsibilities, but also legal power, employees less so. And there has always been this ability. I mean, we talk a lot about the fact that people have the legal right to strike. They don't actually have any legal right to strike in the UK. What you have is that if you've gone through the checks, balances and hoops you need to run a lawful ballot, you're immune from being disciplined or dismissed as a result of taking strike action. So it's a widely misunderstood area. Now, of course, the reality is around strike that there isn't one single argument because, of course, the biggest argument for CSP members against striking is that it's not what they got into the game to do. What people want to do is treat their patients, provide excellent services and be fairly remunerated for doing so. And the last thing anyone wants to do is not to be doing that. And I mean, on the picket lines, you've been on picket lines yourself, Jack. When I was at Addenbrooke's on the day of the first strike, I was with a group of people who were literally walking in and out of the hospital talking to their patients about why they weren't going to see them that day. And the patients were joining us on the picket lines, but they were also people who were distraught at not being able to provide that service. So I would say, as a physio myself by background, as you know, that for us, those are the biggest reason. That's the biggest thing that goes against it. For others, I think it's different. So I think for some people it's loss of pay, but of course the right to strike is an essential right. And is sparingly used, whatever your views are about strikes in other parts of the economy, sparingly used. And in the case of physiotherapy, exceptionally sparingly used. So I think what it tells us is how desperate things are when we've got to that point.
So that's really helpful for us to set some context, I think, to this conversation and to the reason for me starting with that question. So for those that maybe have been paying a bit of attention on social media, I've been speaking out as both as me generally, as well as my new role as a member of council at the CSP in favour of strike action. And we'll happily expand on that as part of this podcast for those that are interested. But similarly, Claire, tell us a little bit about your role at the CSP, because we speak, of course, as colleagues, but also I knew that in the spirit of conversation, you'd be happy for me to sort of us to get into the weeds, not just on the detail of why physio strike action, but also those top level things about sometimes people are a bit squeamish about these sorts of things. And it seems smart for us to make sure we do visit the corners of the argument that sometimes people feel get neglected. So firstly, tell us a bit about what you do at the CSP. And why you fit for this conversation?
Yeah. Well, and actually, before I do that, what I'm just going to say, which is partly in response to what you said, but is also part of my previous answer, which is, of course, industrial action and whether one who might be affected by it takes it or not is and always will be an entirely individual personal choice. And everyone can exercise that choice depending on where the balance for them is. So my role at the CSP, I've been at the CSP nearly 30 years. I've had several different roles, all in the employment relations, trade union side of the organisation, starting as the health and safety officer, but role now is the director of employment relations and union services. So I head up the arm of the organisation that's doing the day-to-day work of being a union. So I'm involved not only obviously in managing and leading the staff in that respect, but also national negotiations, because you'll already know this, Jack, that across the UK, pay, pensions, terms and conditions for people employed in the NHS is done once nationally to an extent, and 4 times across the 4 countries in other aspects. Yeah, so that's my job.
Now, when it comes to the decisions to strike, it's sort of relevant that it coincides culturally with various other strike action being taken. And that's not coincidental, of course, because these things do overlap and intersect. So in the spirit of my first question, I'll give a reflection as to what I think probably makes me, when I was grappling with it, especially not just as me as a person, me as a CSP member, me as someone who's passionate about the trade union movement, but also just as part of my new role on council, I felt that the strongest case against it is who doesn't deserve a pay rise. Therefore, it almost becomes this interesting thing whereby you're sticking your head above the parapet in a context of which everyone's got a fairly legitimate reason for aspiring for pay rise, and that the circumstances post-COVID means you're then in a situation where if everyone deserves it, is that feasible? And then it becomes this really complex macroeconomic issue whereby it is very difficult to understand whether or not that is a consequence. Does that fuel inflation? All these sort of really quite seemingly very challenging arguments that I had to get me sort of economics for dummies books type thing out to try and really get my head around my own understanding, because I'm a sucker for detail. So I thought I'd just sort of spit that out and see, firstly, do you have any sympathy in that direction for that style of argument? And is it something that you've perhaps heard from any of the either members, or have you heard that bubbling around in a sort of cultural sense?
Yeah, great thinking. And of course, exactly all of that about what is the macro-political, macroeconomic context is what we are, the context we're operating in all the time, and we're reviewing it all the time. I mean, I think, to be honest, the members, the very few members that we've been contacted by who are actively not in support of the strike action, it's not any of those things. What it is that they joined a profession that they just don't believe it's professional to take strike action, full stop. Right. So I think we acknowledge that those are people's individual choices. I think I totally agree with what you're saying. And of course, you and some others, I've talked to a lot of very well-informed people on the picket lines and elsewhere, will be looking into what the economic commentators and others are saying, but not everyone will. And of course, you will have heard many people are in the media saying that actually, of course, the government's very common line about public sector wages in particular fueling inflation is economically flawed, and that actually public sector wages tend to chase inflation. And we know that inflation has come to the high level it has for a whole host of reasons, probably haven't got time to go into today. But where I think I would come down very strongly is that regardless of the macroeconomic situation, any government in relation to its public sector workers, and it doesn't matter how you determine pay, whether it's through what we call collective bargaining, negotiation, whether it's through pay review bodies or any other thing, essentially the government is the employer pretty much directly of those in the public sector. And therefore, there are political choices about not only the things that government spends money on, but also, of course, the extent to which they spend money and the amount of borrowing they're prepared to countenance having, and so on. So I think this idea that we have in our own lives, which is that, you've got a pot of 5p's and when it's empty, doesn't obviously really apply. And as someone who, is not the best grasper of those macro things, the fact that money is sort of, elastic and related to borrowing is not always an easy concept. However, I think that, you'll know, Jack, that at the CSP and in the health unions in particular, we've seen this crisis coming for a long time. And we've been saying for a long time, it'll only take one or two big global or international issues to kick this very suddenly past a tipping point. Public sector workers have withstood long years of pay caps, as you expect in recession and times of austerity. But what this is now combined with is, of course, very low levels of actual unemployment, forget about quality of work and underemployment, which means that people exercise choice. So it's not only the sort of moral arguments about how we value our public sector workers through pay, but it's also the market. So people who are talking about market-driven economic policy, what you've got to say at the moment is the market is telling you that you cannot keep the people you need to keep at the moment unless you pay them more. And the other thing I would say, and you know, this is not a neat, perfect argument either, but it still remains true. Not maybe as much for people who are self-employed or run their own businesses like you, and you will know more about this than me, but for physios who are employees, it almost doesn't matter who the employer is. Largely, if you're an employee, or even if you're a worker, as opposed to someone who's truly self-employed and working on their own account, it's still the case within fairly small parameters that NHS pay, NHS conditions sets the bar for physiotherapy more widely. So you will find places outside the NHS where you've got pays a bit lower, but support for CPD is better, or pays a bit higher because the pension isn't as good. But you are talking about fairly modest change. So the NHS, employer of at any one time about 26,000 physios, plus the students in the system, sets the bar for a much wider group of people.
It does set that context, that base, right? Especially on a basic sociological level. It's very strange if you're not, say in a practice like mine, if you're not paying attention to what a middling band 6 would be, that you're trying to then move across as an associate even for a few hours, and what they're therefore wanting to match. Or if they're working, say, I'm going to lend myself a couple of evenings and a Saturday, then it's going to be that and a bit of a premium, because that's the nature of it. So drawing across is sensible. But one of the things that really moved me as well is that it's pay and conditions. Of course, it always needs to be. And also then for us to then apply that politically, like what are we failing to recognize the recruitment and retention challenge that then is faced? Do we truly believe in free at the point of access healthcare in this country that needs to be in that? And that's me saying that as someone that, you know, it's such a silly conflict of which we of course know that the implosion of local services, if waiting lists go crazy high locally, then I might get more people somewhat out of desperation having to come through our door with cash in hand, right? And it breaks my heart. Similarly, we get more and more domiciliary calls, you know, asking, again, desperate families willing to spend a bit of money to try and just get someone seen and into somewhat inappropriate services, right? So those sorts of factors sort of really move us emotionally and politically. But it's also really naive for us to not then think carefully then about the context in which we're then basically needing to stand up and be counted, cry for help, for want of a better term, and say, look, enough's enough. And so these things need to be seen in that context whereby recruitment and retention, loss of gyms, loss of pools, all of this stuff you've heard me speak about before, and I know you have. Then what are people suggesting is done to make noise, if not something as drastic as this? And forgive me, risk of repeating myself a little bit, but for those that are inherently designed to problem solve, by disposition, we've gone into something that is based on us reasoning our way out of it. It is only as a means of desperation and as a means of being ignored for too long or being taken advantage of for too long that people are standing up. And so it just seems to me that is where it is tempting as an argument against to imply that it is nothing more than a whinge upwards about money, when actually it needs to be seen in its fullest form of the consequences on the entirety of healthcare in this country.
I mean, that's right. And of course, you know, I mean, the whinging upwards is a great way of putting it, because of course, in a way, you could argue that outside of very rare periods of strike action, isn't that what you pay people like me to do? You know, I mean, that's our job, is to say, you know, our members are having a terrible time, they definitely need more money. But I mean, I think I don't want us to think that the whole of the move to take industrial action is entirely altruistic relating to patients, because of course that's a one-sided argument. But just, of course, you know, and I've been now on a lot of picket lines over the 2 strike days, and I've talked to many tens and tens of members in that process. But it is all about patients, actually, and you've seen this. But what I've seen also is that I've seen people on picket lines saying, this feels like the old days. This feels like a time when we did have time to talk to each other, see how, you know, we're meeting people we haven't seen for months, because I mean, and this is the NHS that I worked in and loved when I was a young physio. And of course, things never stay the same, but I think it has also started to make people feel that real there's nothing like a bunch of physio staff. I mean, you've seen the picket lines full of young women, dogs, cats, even babies in slings, kids in pushchairs, fun, homemade placards, dancing, exercise. There's not a bunch of people like them, in my view. Everything about the profession that we all love is such that it is critically changing the very stereotypical public view of what a strike looks like and what a trade unionist actually looks like, which is, it's not what people would say they don't want to be associated with. It's what we've seen on picket lines the last couple of months. But the other thing I just want to say about what members deserve themselves, and I've in the media, I've obviously repeated things about the people visiting food banks and the other factors. But the thing that moved me probably more than any of those, and this is not a single story, the night before the first strike, when myself and Elaine, my assistant director, were off to see the Secretary of State, just before that, I saw a tweet from a member who had said to me she had worked in the acute sector on wards. Actually, she'd been a ward-based physio working in acute medical for years. She absolutely loved it. She was driven to have a really serious breakdown by the pressures of work and not being able to do what she wanted for her patients. She spent 4 months as an inpatient in the mental health unit in her own hospital, and she now works outside the NHS and just knows that she can never healthily, she doesn't have the resilience now ever to work in the NHS. So I just want government to understand as well that lifelong loss of health, resilience, as well as wealth, if you like, money, that people are being exposed to at the moment. And it is an absolute disgrace because, of course, your employer, who's responsible for you contractually, cannot fix this for you. And that's, and so what we've learned in this dispute is that, and this is unprecedented actually, regardless of who's in government, what we've learned in this dispute is, to an extent, if they choose to, central government can just draw up the drawbridge, shut the door and stonewall this vast kind of outpouring of staff everywhere, employees everywhere. And that gives pause for thought to people like me about how we do all sorts of things. And to some extent, that's what I'm paid to think about. But I do think that you would be, I mean, what's really interesting, the CSP's been doing some polling on the back of other polling, and you'll know that public support for better pay, but also strikes amongst physiotherapy workers, public support for physios is higher than doctors, as high as nurses and paramedics, and it's not dropping at all as we move through strikes. Public support's actually slightly going up. So there is unprecedented level of public support. And I don't necessarily think it's public support that people should get huge pay rises when others in the economy are suffering. But what everyone can see is that people who all just want to do a good job, and no one could say that NHS workers are greedy around pay in the same way that physios outside the NHS are greedy about pay, because physiotherapy is not greedy for money in that way. But what I think you would say is that people care a lot about their patients, but they also have to be able to pay their bills and live their own lives and be reasonably healthy. And at the moment, government wants to talk to us about expanding the profession, which is fantastic because we want everyone to understand the critical nature of physiotherapy for an aging population and health and all of those things and quality of life. But, you can't keep pouring water into a bucket with a massive hole at the bottom, which is why we keep saying, you got to sort the pay first.
Yeah, want to expand the profession so we can have more absolute husks of people of vacancies, as well as like we say, hollowed out shells of people that happen to be bodies but not spirits actually trying to do the doing. I want to come back to the public support thing in a second, so please do remind me to go back there. But I just wondered if I could just again play devil's advocate a little over the fact that, as you said, local employers and departments and stuff can't solve this sort of thing, in part because of ever more centralized sort of determinations on pay scales, etc. Something that I imagine politically, etc., that you would support. So to some extent, it's argued that this is the cows coming home to roost to some extent. The fact that then no market forces can play, quality clinicians that might go in and say, look, I've been given this offer and it's got extra zeros on it. What are you going to do about it? Means that then there's just increasingly very difficult things to people to be able to work for, including it being literally not allowed for them to start then thinking where else they could pull from budgets. So just your thoughts and reflections on that as a consequence perhaps of your own politics.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've had Agenda for Change in the NHS, which harmonised terms, conditions, pay and pensions for everyone outside of medics and dentists for 20 years now. And central determination for a big service like the NHS of those things is not perfect any more than local determination is, because there will always be things that would be better if you could do the opposite. But our experience shows us, and we had quite a big flirtation with local pay in the early 90s. And in fact, when I was, funnily enough, I was working in the NHS then, and I was doing my master's degree in industrial relations at the time, and did my dissertation on this, the advent of local bargaining. And of course, what it showed is, first of all, exactly what we said at the beginning, which is the rate for the job is basically the rate for the job, and you can't vary it that much. So you have thousands of people not generally very well equipped in terms of the knowledge and skills to do it, bargaining over things that amount to about £2.50 difference from next door in real terms. It's clear that you've got a service of more than 1 million people, and that actually the most effective, most efficient and most sustainable way of doing that is to do it once for as many things as you can, and only do things locally. So recruitment and retention premium are obviously available locally when you really need to, because although it does create some comparative inequities, so of course, you've got London waiting, high cost area supplements, but you've got a lot of places that are very expensive where people don't get that. And of course, you've got other areas of the country where what you earn as a band 7 physio is going to take you a lot further. But what it doesn't do, and this was the problem with local pay, is it hugely disrupts the natural movement of people around the country to work. And it disrupts things like moving on for your professional development, because people are moving because they want more money, if they need more money. But sometimes then employers are forming cartels to try and stop that happening. And it's just, in a system as big and monolithic as the NHS, it's very difficult. But what the NHS has to understand, and those of us that are doing this all the time, I think, do understand, which is essentially, we talk about it's important that the NHS doesn't become politicised. Total and utter rubbish. The NHS is an entirely politicised thing, because it is effectively controlled by central government. And there are lots of other services where that applies to a lesser extent, but the NHS is probably the one that is most the case. So, you've got these layers of people you work with, so unions and employers working together, and representatives of those at a sort of national level. But then essentially you've got one person, party, government, holding the purse strings, and that will inevitably colour everything you can do. So my view would be, a bit like democracy, it's terrible other than it's better than everything else. That, so yes, it's not perfect, but it's certainly better than the local alternatives overall.
It's Churchill quote, isn't it? That democracy, terrible system, but better than all the others.
Better than all the others, yeah. Exactly.
We won't fight about it on this show, Claire. But I say the same about capitalism.
There's a drink in that somewhere for another evening, Jack.
let's do that. Let's do that. As I say, that's one for another show or three. What I wanted to go to, though, I mentioned about public sentiment, which I agree with, by the way. I've seen that data as well as then, I'm feeling it. And also seeing how many people are being persuaded that you would maybe not have expected to pipe up in support of such things. But one thing I wanted to just ask you more on the theoretic then is that could you tell me about a strike action or negotiation in collective bargaining, either recently or in history, that you don't agree with?
In terms of outcome?
No, not necessarily in terms of outcome. I'm saying, well, surely in theory, as a thoughtful person, there is such thing as people taking the piss and going too far in that direction. Can you tell me about one?
Oh, gosh, let me think of one. Well, I mean, yeah, certainly. So if you think back to, these won't be things I've been involved in myself, but if you think back to lots of occasions when our economy was based much more on industrial manufacturing and much less on the service industry, and now tech. And you will know, because you'll know about the history of it, that some of the things that were done then around restrictive practices, for example, where, for people who could bring a whole factory to close. I mean, those sorts of things, of course, just no longer exist. And of course, the reality is that, if you think about the theoretical argument you were just referring to, that everything that a group of workers or employees do is whether you like it or not, in order to try and redress the imbalance of power between organisations and individuals, thinking of the theory. And it's for people to judge when that's gone too far. Now, I think the fact that I can't think of one I've been involved in, and I've been either in or around the profession for more than 40 years. I started training more than 40 years ago. Just shows you how long it is since that's been the case. Because, of course, if you go back to the political arguments in the 70s about unions running the country, well, I think if you unpick that, I'm not sure how well that even stands up, actually. But in recent years, recent decades, of course, it couldn't have been more different than that. So I cannot think of an agreement that hasn't been rightly reached, rather than, I think what you're suggesting is that sometimes people might use their market advantage to get something that actually couldn't really be justified. But I mean, I think that, that exists everywhere, doesn't it? So if you think about what elite sports people get paid in comparison to what jobbing physios get paid, if you think about what people that are very strategic and very much in demand get paid. So say if you take take a group of pilots, a group of doctors, a group of lawyers, and a group of something else. And what you get paid is always a combination, isn't it, of your skills, your shortages, so how many of you are available, and your market strategically, how strategically you're placed in your market, and whether or not it's a monopoly. So these things are they're never purely about worth. And what I really admire about physiotherapy, not just because I come from the profession myself, is that wherever physios work, in whatever sector, whatever they're doing, I have never met a physio who is not more interested in the intrinsic contribution and value of what they do for the people they're looking after than money. That doesn't mean there aren't people who aren't motivated by money, but it is never all about that. It just isn't, because that's not what you go into a caring profession for, is it? I mean, you do something totally different.
Well, it's a weird, exactly. Because I'm someone that I'm not there for some are, and I understand why they might be. And I think me in a yesteryear maybe was a bit squeamish about those that really the pound signs are the primary. But it's just so rare in our game, because you've not gone into healthcare. Now with those that pivot very quickly, 18 months in, they're a sales rep, or they've gone into health tech very quickly as a means of leveraging a medical badge. Again, I'm not calling them for chasing the pounds, but fundamentally they're not building that on a base or credibility. So I think it's incredibly rare and very short-sighted, and clearly a sort of a deep political bias when people imply that is going on in healthcare, because it's just the skill set, especially that most physios have. It adds zeros to salaries very easily, especially once you've developed into some seniority, especially if you've then developed some managerial experience. The way in which we utilize reason, the way in which we have to pull from evidence as well as application. So there's just increasingly these days, there isn't an algorithm turning up to help you decision make. Means that as soon as you play that skill set into other markets, that's where they could make money, and they would do if it was all about that. But they really do care about the grassroots. So I think that's definitely where my head's at. I suppose just to finish the point that your answer was a good one, but it's just that to finish the point on that, there is a version whereby, let's say hypothetically, physio was saying, well, 35% raise, or we're going to raise hell. We're in a situation where we're not easily automated. And similarly, because there's a ceiling limit to, say, train drivers or even pilots, let's say, it's not long until that becomes a thing. And if there's a political will to sort of liberalize regulation on automatic planes, then we know that that's a vulnerability. We feel a bit safer in a way as physiotherapists, only slightly, but to some extent, compared to in the medical profession, radiologists have got it harder, say, than physios with regards to that challenge from technology. So I just thought, in terms of that, do you keep an eye on thinking, right, when it comes to sort of picking demands, etc., there is a version of that whereby people can't help but get carried away on some of those demands, where there is eventually a line, isn't there?
Well, I think it's a great point. And of course, because these things are so rarely absolutes, they all come down to, your own values, personal values, don't they? So, I mean, I always think about this in relation to tiny things like expenses. So, when members of organisations or staff in organisations claim expenses, and no one is claiming outside of what they should, but some people all claim for, you know, I don't know, the £2 toll as well as the £100 train ticket and a cup of coffee at every station or whatever. And those things, they're not wrong, but they're not always things that, you know, some of us have values that will say that's absolutely right and we should encourage everyone to do that. So all of these things, the point I'm making is all of it is judgment based on your values rather than absolutes.
Yes. Okay.
So that's the first thing. But I think in the NHS, I mean, the other interesting thing, if we take out, there's 3 unions representing doctors and dentists. Outside of that, all the other more than 1 million covered by Agenda for Change are represented by 14 unions. Some are very small, some are very big. Some are very big outside the NHS, but not in the NHS. So we have what's called single table bargaining. So one harmonised system for all of those staff, which is what Agenda for Change delivered. And we have what's called single table bargaining, but it's massive. It's the biggest, most multi-union environment in the UK. There's nowhere else that's got 14 unions all trying to work into one harmonised pay system.
Are you saying 40 or 14 there?
1-4. Yeah. So, but what I mean, there's nowhere else. Most industries have got 3 or 4. So you've got a huge number of people. Some very small specialist unions that are also professional bodies. Other big traditional unions, and you're all working together. And in some ways, that can be very difficult, very challenging. It's certainly been very challenging this year, with people like the Royal College of Nursing having an individual claim, the other 13 having a claim together. But it also provides a lot of checks and balances around the value thing that you're talking about. So there'll be some groups within that are very small, but very strategic. And there'll be others who are very big, but their members are not working in such strategic areas. And then, of course, alongside all of that in the health service is that, you know, you are never going to put people's lives at risk. So there's all of that going on around, even if you're strategically placed. You don't just get, it's not like a factory, is it? You don't just get 5,000 people going, oh, we're off then, and walking out the door and not coming back till tomorrow, because people die in numbers. So, I mean, for all of those reasons, there are checks and balances around what we might otherwise interpret either, if we're one sort of person, as just what people deserve, which is anything as much as you can get, or what others would see as greed. Now, the thing you'd say about the physiotherapy profession, by and large, is kind of at the other end of that, which is getting people to advocate for what they're worth more and better. Because I think often physiotherapy sells itself short when we talk to members about what they deserve, and they go, oh, I don't want to make a fuss, or, you know, this sort of, I don't want to ask for too much. People don't like to be seen to be asking for too much or expecting too much. So I think, if anything, what's happened this year is helping people to realise it's not impolite, that you won't lose public support if you say you deserve not to be working in the kind of dungeon of the hospital, working 4 hours unpaid overtime a day, for example. And I think that is a necessary thing at such a very difficult time.
I think what's funny as well, it's an overused term in lots of ways now, but I think we have been gaslit over our value for so long now, in that partly what we said before about the base rate, understanding the base rate, is that we're sort of assuming that to be the standard, when fundamentally the evidence base, especially over the last 15, 20 years, that has continued to point in our direction, rehabilitation being front and center, everything always sort of threatens to be the next big thing, but usually what happens is, even as in the current technological revolution, we know that it's only assisting triage that then points more and more people in our direction, rather than, say, surgeons or interventions. So therefore, that's where sometimes we can be complacent in thinking that we need to pivot from what we've been paid historically, or what the standard is, or where we would typically graduate into as a banding, and instead start thinking about maturing our analysis in social value as to what we do for the economy, or for even just society, if we try to strip money from it briefly, is to try and think, what is our social worth considering our diverse skill set? And that needs to be adjusted in keeping with the evidence. And we need to, I've been reflecting a lot recently on how we learn to communicate that as a profession through various different things, including broadcast channels like this, but then also, of course, as I said at the start, we're colleagues as part of the CSP, of which how might the CSP start to articulate that? Because that's the perfect bridge between sort of professional issues, communication to multiple stakeholders, as well as, of course, union services, of which is unique about the CSP is that it's all of the above. So again, I've probably said a lot there, but it definitely sort of tries to, that's how I tie all this together as to why I why I was quite passionate about strike action right now is to say we need a wake-up call internally as well about self-worth, because we're constantly adjusting ourselves down on sort of a historic precedent that's probably unjust anyway. It was then, and it especially is now.
I mean, I think those are great points. And I think, of course, one of the problems with when you've got, I mean, you mentioned a few minutes ago the issue about the sort of bigger public discussions that we don't have around the NHS. So, you know, the sort of unthinkable discussion about the NHS model, healthcare free at the point of need. And we talk about, you know, no top-down rationing. There is rationing every day in the NHS now. We all know it. So, I mean, that discussion takes place. But also, of course, where you've got a public service funded by government through general taxation, for a start, your views on social value inevitably have got to use the jargon, align with the government's view of social value because of the funding. So that's one thing I think that changes. But also, I think you're absolutely right. And I was talking to a couple of physios on one of the picket lines who were saying, you know, we think we're quite fortunate in terms of staffing. They were working in neurosciences, but they were saying, and good for them now, is seeing patients twice a week who, if they were, you know, going back at just a few years, they'd be seeing them twice a day. So, I mean, you know, we have, you know, we've had to, and that's rationing by a different name. It's rationing based on clinical judgment. But, you know, all of that is, as we know, contributing hugely to, you know, people not being able to get out of hospital early enough and all of that. I think you're right. I think it's very difficult for people because, of course, you only tend to see the little bit you're in at the moment. And someone else was saying to me that, you know, they've usually got someone asking them the first question while they're still taking their coats off when they arrive in the morning. So there's literally no thinking time to do exactly what you're saying, which is how do we do this? Now, what I would say, though, is when we went to the meeting with the Secretary of State the night before the first strike, and we wanted to talk about pay, obviously, him not so much. And what was really fascinating then was the Secretary of State asked us to come and meet with the junior minister to talk about rehab and our other areas because of the importance of expanding the workforce. Now, and this is, you know, as you know, Karen's retiring at the end of this year. Massive legacy for Karen, actually, which is a decade ago, we were knocking on closed doors to talk about the importance of physiotherapy expansion. And we had people all around the country saying, actually, our workforce planning indicates we don't need more physios. Maybe, in fact, we're slightly in oversupply. And now we could not be more different. No, the government's knocking on our door to say we need workforce expansion. So we have made the argument about the importance of physiotherapy for the health of the UK population, wherever and however and by whoever that's provided. And the problem we've got to fix now is not repeating what we've done before, which is not us, but government, which is to make life so, frankly, bloody miserable for people that it becomes unsustainable, as well as being something that's not well remunerated. And when we talk about what the rate for the job is for physiotherapy, it's not about feeling it's impolite to ask for money. It's the fact that we devalue what the profession is worth and the contribution we can make if we say, you know, we'll do it for a £5 or whatever the NHS equivalent is. And the last thing I would say is, of course, in the NHS does have a lot of checks and balances around fairness, equity, and equal pay, particularly because it is held together by a single, very scientific and as much as they can be, equal pay proof job evaluation scheme, where you are actually properly evaluating the demands of a job. Now, there's an argument about whether those change over time, but that's why, in fact, when we started Agenda for Change, a lot of physios went into bands higher than the people they'd traditionally been in the same grades as, because of all the things you've said about this broad contribution of what physios do. Yeah,
no, I think, and that's definitely worth giving that historical context to. I've certainly been keen for this podcast, as it hasn't been, to just sort of talk about this sort of timeline of what's been happening for events, but that doesn't mean that that's not a relevant part of it as well. So I want to encourage the listeners to follow you on Twitter. You keep us up to date on there, as well as keep an eye, of course, on CSP feeds. I'll do what I can to share the important pieces of that as well. But tell us a little bit about how people can support and discuss Strike Action and what channels it's worth them paying attention to, as at the moment it will be proceeding.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jack. And of course, the first thing I'd say is people will have their own social networks, but there is constantly updated information on the relevant pages of the CSP website, because the situation is different, slightly different in all 4 countries. You can look at it country by country. I think where we've got specific events coming up where we are taking strike action or holding meetings for other things, we've been sending out all the ways that people can help. So pop along to visit, take a few biscuits, send out a message of support, talk to your local MP. For these purposes, we're interested obviously in influencing local Conservative MPs to support NHS staff and NHS pay. So there's a whole range of things that people can find on our website that they can do. But what I would say is that the support, what we'd call in trade union terms, the solidarity shown by fellow professionals and their families, is absolutely massively important to people. You'll have seen it yourself when you were on the picket line, and you only need to visit physios on a picket line to realise that everything we've said, that this is not about greed, this is not about wanting to be difficult, this is not about any of those things. This is about people who are desperate to have enough colleagues there to do the work that they want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that is continuing to ring true. And the more we speak about that openly and honestly, the more people can realise that you can keep trying to paint cartoons and caricatures, but it doesn't stick because it's not true and it's not fair. And so I invite everyone, as always, to discuss this. But I thank you so much for joining me in a wide-ranging sort of debate of these issues, Claire. As ever, you're always forthcoming on it.
Jack.
I think I've been hopefully fairly consistent over the years, and the audience should have hopefully spotted that I've been a fan of the CSP's trade union work over many years, and it's only really getting closer and closer to the organisation, and now, of course, sitting on council, for me to realise that one of the reasons for that is your leadership. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it.
Very kind.
And certainly Elaine and others in your team that do fantastic work. So looking forward to seeing what's next, because I think we're in a strong position, but also it's great that everyone can see just how reasonable that position is for us to actually get the right thing done, and for it to not just be a win, just some people sometimes like to caricature it as. So thanks again for your time, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you, Jack.
Cheers. Take care.
Here at Physio Matters, we think physio matters. Join as a premium member now and access over 500 videos, get free tickets to shows and upgrades included. Access at home, work or on a unicycle to take your knowledge to the moon. Physio-matters.com, more content than you can fit into a gym.